co-management environment where those who are at the table have enough trust and goodwill and understanding of one another through the various ways you achieve that we talked about earlier, that you can get to these places. And I think that's a really powerful thing. I think that, to be able to demonstrate with these case examples to, let me say, the ministerial doubters, or for that matter, in circumstances, Indigenous leaders who are doubters based on all sorts of, like a history of broken promises and infringement. There are these kind of case examples to kind of push through. So,
welcome to the Co-Management Commons podcast. My name is Jamie Snook. I am your podcast host, and I have been working in and with Indigenous communities for over 20 years now. I am joined in this podcast by some of the leading practitioners, researchers, elders, and community members from this sector, where we discuss co-management in Canada with Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. Please check out the show notes, where we always share lots of other resources. And in between episodes, your feedback is always encouraged and appreciated. So thank you very much once again, and take care. Just really excited today to welcome Mr. Mark Wedge and Lindsay Staples to the Co-Management podcast, two gentlemen that have been doing work in the co-management sector in the Yukon Territory for decades now, and it's a real honor to get some time with you both and get some free advice in our pre-podcast chat. It was really helpful, and really looking forward to the discussion. And we always like to start off by letting people introduce themselves, because not everyone in Canada would necessarily know you both from the co-management sector. So maybe we could start off with you, Mark, to give yourself a little bit of an overview of who you are and how you've been involved in co-management over the years.
Thank you. So my name is, I have 6 names. My European-based names, or Anglophone-based names, or settler-based names, or however you want to define it now, is Mark Wallace Wedge. And I have 3 traditional names. The one that was after Jake Jackson, who was out of Teslin, was Dea Duhen. And the other one is after Tommy Smarch from Cartcross, Tlaguha. And the third one was from Matthew Fred from Angoon, Kaangu Shu. And they're all Deshiton names because I'm Deshiton. We have a clan system, our governance structure is a clan system. We operate around that. And I started off, and I guess when I graduated from high school, I thought, well, I can't get kicked out of school. So I wrote a letter to the Minister of Education, Hilda Watson at the time, and said, the way you're doing education isn't working for Indigenous peoples, right? And that you really need to sort of rethink about how you do that. But I never ever got a response, so I'm not sure what happened with that. And I didn't get kicked out of school. And I guess my whole sort of life has been around negotiating treaties and governance and these types of things. So we started off in, very early with 1969 was something called the White Paper that started a lot of stuff happening. And one of the things is because my mother married my father, who was a settler, she lost her status. And of course, then we lost our status. So after 1969, and it led into the Bill C-31, right, got her status back. And so it was really interesting because how we manage the land and how you do that when you don't have status or you're not, right? And I saw my mother do a lot of that stuff, although she wouldn't call it that, right? In terms of there's stuff that happened culturally, people would come by and they would visit And she would tell him, oh, so and so was up here. They didn't see any game, but nobody's been up Black Lake. So maybe you want to check that out. Right. And so she sort of managed and sort of helped people sort of with this type of stuff. But anyway, that's sort of some of my background. I served as a chief. I served as executive director and CEO of Dun & Ventures, Yukon Indian Development Corporation. I sat on a number of different boards, National Roundtable, Western Economic Development Committee. And yeah, so I've been served as chief, served as executive director for, back then it was called CYI. So I have some management or some, I don't know what you call it, experience, I guess.
Right. And when did you first meet Lindsay Staples? How long ago was that?
That was a long time ago.
Was it ever? Right?
We, Barry Stewart, actually, who was a judge here, and worked with Canada's response to the Brundtland Commission, which is the United Nations sort of commission, was to develop a roundtable, right? And to start a dialogue between the environment and the economy, because what they recognized, the biggest impact on the environment was the economy, and it was having the biggest impact. And so they started the process to create a dialogue or a group in which they would start talking about how do we reconcile some of these things. And they formed this thing called the National Roundtable. And one of the things they did in every province and territory was set up sort of provincial or territorial roundtables. And I was asked to sit in one of those, and our chair and beloved leader, and I would hold my hands up to him, was Lindsay Staples.
He's up there.
Managed that, and he's going to pay for this after. But no, it was a very a learning experience, and it was very innovative, I thought, right, in terms of this. So that was, I think, one of the first times we began to sort of actually sit together and started looking at around dispute resolution, environmental, co-management, co-governance, all these kinds of things that sort of came out of it.
Would you like to introduce Lindsay for our listeners then, or should we let him do that on his own, or would you like to do it?
I think I'd prefer to do that.
Let me frame the question around which we can do the introduction. Right? In a lot of Indigenous philosophy, we have this thing called a medicine wheel, which is about the spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical balance of who we are as human beings. And I would like Lindsay maybe to describe who he is around the medicine wheel. How does he express his spirituality? Is he emotionally competent?
I would say that in terms of the quadrants in the medicine wheel, that I'm not sure I've ever achieved perfect balance across the various quadrants. And indeed, I think it's fair to say that I've been seriously out of balance with respect to many of them. Not that I haven't spent time in each of them. And I think, if anything, being, quasi-retired now, I think, quite frankly, one of my concerted efforts is to try and achieve better balance across the emotional, the physical, the spiritual, and just do a better job of kind of living, through those various elements of the wheel. I think the other thing is it's going to be evident that Mark and I have known each other for quite a while, like multiple decades. And, I met him when I was a younger man, as he was. And at the time, I was involved in doing a lot of work with land claims implementation with the Inuvialuit in the Western Arctic. And to that end, after many years of working with them, and I think it's a theme that we'll probably touch on today in terms of how you make these relationships work between individuals, but also between institutions and governments, is the element of trust. And, trust is not built up overnight. And so, changing these relationships, takes time. And, one of the great honors in my career that was a function of a longstanding relationship and trust was when an Inuvialuit elder gave me an Inuvialuit name, which is Kassan. And, quite frankly, that was one of the most important kind of moments of my entire career. And I think, as a feature of that, these relationships that we develop, quite apart from whatever we might talk about today in terms of legal frameworks, policy frameworks and so on, it's really in so many ways what happens between people that can, I think, do a long way to breaking through those so-called glass ceilings, whether they're legal or whether they're policy or whether they're cultural. And I think these relationships that we develop are really important. So when Mark referred earlier to this roundtable on the environment and the economy that he and I both sat on, and that's a roundtable of status of women, labor, the mining community, the business community, First Nations, environmental groups. One of the I think that was so special to that was we were able to bring into that room, I guess you could say, kind of a cultural shift in terms of how we conducted meetings and how we conducted our relations with each other. So, the stuff that I'm speaking to is what I would consider many people to kind of consider the soft stuff and not the hard edge. But I would want to make, I think for me, an important point in today's conversation that stuff is absolutely instrumental in moving people, individuals of disparate value systems, different cultural backgrounds to a common place. So without going on about it, quite simply, one of the things that Mark and his First Nation colleagues on the council was introduced at the beginning of every meeting. We moved toward having a smudge, and that was a really profound way of shaping or shifting the whole tenor of the discussion in these meetings. And as a consequence, we were able to achieve consensus on some very thorny issues. This was a group that was an advisory body, the primary advisory body outside of government to the Yukon cabinet. And so they threw some really divisive, thorny issues for the council to address. And we consistently produced consensus outcomes. And I think that was a feature of the cultural shift we were able to achieve in that room and with that group.
So can I add a little bit to his introduction, Jamie?
Yeah, go for it.
He is forgetting some important pieces. If we take that medicine wheel, we start saying, what's the expression of spirituality? And there was a study that was done on the west coast of Vancouver Island that looked at all the sacred teachings, different religious groups and organizations, and wanted to know what was common amongst all of them. And the thing that they found common amongst all of them, that they all reinforced the virtues. How to be a kind person, how to be an honest person, a truthful person, right? And I look at Lindsay, he does fit that bill, right? That expression of those virtues sort of is an expression of his spirituality. And so I would say he's a very spiritual person. And then earlier, when we talked about emotional competency, because when the National Roundtable and a lot of these work that we're doing in both the environmental and economic, there's a lot of emotions that are happening there. And Dr. Lee Brown, who does a lot of work on emotional competency, says emotions are gifts from Creator that we have to learn how to use, right? And so to be competent with their emotions, if you're feeling angry, is not to express it through violence, but to express it through, an intellectual or, kind of a spiritual kind of response, and that we have that. And so when we're feeling these emotions, so when we would be at the national or the Yukon Council Economy Environment, there were some very emotional issues. And I think Lindsay was able to channel those emotions, not into a hard way, but into a positive way, which helps you to get to consensus, how to work with that. And of course, intellectual, we measure our IQ in terms of how much knowledge we know in terms of the general public. But when you start looking at intellectual, it's about how do you use that knowledge to process it to positive outcomes. And so it's being able to take things like, that were issues with the National Roundtable or these types of things, and to be able to reframe or reshape it sort of into sort of positive solutions and whatnot, and that intellectual. And I think Lindsay does excel at a lot of that. That's why we constantly call on him to do these things. And of course, physically, of course, is not only about health, but it's about the environment. And there's a balance between that, because how we define recreation is to get out and to use the parks and to use these areas. And what are we recreating? Well, we're recreating our balance, our emotional, spiritual, intellectual, physical kind of thing. And that's why recreation, parks, and all these things become very important from an environmental perspective. So I would say that Lindsay's a really emotionally competent and a spiritual and physically balanced and intellectually balanced person. And he's going to have to pay me for that later.
He's definitely a physical specimen. I don't think he's aged since I've seen him. So he's doing something really good here. And I got to say, I wasn't expecting our conversation to start off this way and jump right into emotional competence. I didn't even know it was on our agenda today. And but I think it's super interesting because it's something that does help facilitate consensus, like you said, and so many people out there, whether they're biologists or other sort of identities that they take on through their training and whatnot. It's not an area that people often talk about, and I'm kind of curious. I don't know if you'd want to give an assessment of the emotional competence you've witnessed over your career or not, but have you seen some really good success stories, I guess, where people have actually openly talked about this? It's not something that too often will be on an agenda, so to speak, but it's so relevant.
So, earlier we talked about a ceremony, right? Ceremony is really important when we start into co-governance, co-management, co-things, right? Because what it's really about is the purpose of ceremony, as I've come to understand it and it's sort of been explained to me, is about restoring, rebuilding, or creating relationships. And so a lot of times with the roundtable or in organizations, we have to establish a relationship. So after the first round of treaty failures in the Yukon in 1984-85, when they went back to the drawing board, first thing they did was they went out and Jojo Johnson took them out in the land, right, for 2 weeks, all these negotiators, right, to store that relationship, to start that relationship. And so when you talk about co-governance, co-management, a relationship, and that's why we do ceremony, that's why we do these kinds of things, to establish that relationship. The other thing that we learned with the National Roundtable, we started out, was something called guiding principles, 10 guiding principles, right, to consensus decision making. And what those guiding principles are more around that spiritual realm about how to be respectful of each other, how to be honest with each other, how to be, open-minded, how to be flexible. And so those guiding principles, we used them in the Yukon also as that foundation to start rebuilding that relationship and starting setting a framework about how we were going to consult, how we were going to talk, how we were going to do these kinds of things. So, that's why when you start looking at that, you start saying that's a really fundamental part that a lot of times you don't just throw yourself into this group committee, you have to build a relationship in order for it to last.
What I think is important for me in this conversation, Jamie, I'd be curious at some point to see how this lines up alongside the other podcasts. But if you look generally at the literature on co-management and co-governance, it doesn't speak at all to the very things that we've been talking about for the last 15, 20 minutes. Right. It speaks about jurisdiction, it speaks about decision-making authorities, it talks about who has it, who doesn't. It may talk a little bit about, cross-cultural differences, but it really doesn't get into the fundamentals of relationship building. And, and it's funny, as we're talking about this and the importance of it, I'm struck by, here we are sitting on November the 5th with a U.S. election. People are voting there today. And that is a society that regrettably is so far removed from the very kind of elements that we're talking about here in terms of how you do build cooperation, how you do build trust, how you do build good faith, that, it's kind of a painful realization that as we sit here talking about this, there are parts of the world and indeed in our own backyard where we've got a long way to go to get there. And it's and it's work that never ends. It's building, and Mark's point about ceremony, I think, is really, really important. Ceremonies are important, I think, when institutions embrace them to kind of reaffirm their values, reaffirm their connection to one another. And I think, the potlatch is a wonderful example of that. And maybe it's the penultimate example, ceremonially, of how people come together to kind of share, break bread, overcome their differences, reaffirm their understandings with one another. And of course, without going through that door, historically, you look at the history of the potlatch, and you look at the elimination of the potlatch by the colonial government, the federal government, and the cost of that, what I would argue, wasn't just a cost which was extreme, obviously, on Indigenous people in terms of practices, but there was, I believe, a collateral fallout from that with respect to non-Indigenous Canadian society, because you've got these models where you can learn, you can think about, how you can do things differently. And we basically, as Canadians, took away that opportunity to learn and be informed and be better people through those types of practices and ceremonies.
I just want to pick up a little bit in the potlatch system, so to speak. I'm starting to learn some really big words that are hard for me. And one of them is a bicameral system. And what is a bicameral system, right? And I start thinking, well, I don't know. Maybe that's the wolf and crow. I asked Auntie Angela, my aunt, once, is our culture going to survive? And she pondered and she said, I don't know. She said, look, wolves are marrying wolves and crows are marrying crows, right? So that was the foundation. That bicameral system is a wolf and crow kind of system. And you see in every peoples have some form of it. That's a Democrat Republican, right? Yeah. And it's a Senate plus a Parliament or right? There's this bicameral system. And it's how we do that. And that's why relationship becomes so important, because when those things start fighting or they're right, the systems start breaking down, right? And so you start seeing that and what happens then is that if we look at our current structures in terms of co-governance, co-management, these types of things, how are we accommodating for that? In our system, we have a wolf and a crow. So we have a nakani. And nakani is someone from the opposite side that works with that moiety or those clans to start making sure that things are done in a balanced way, sort of as an overseer, right? That's one form of it. You start looking, you start saying, okay, and that moves different ways. So we have elders plus our, the way we set up our governance structure, which is a combination of some current sort of colonial kind of processes as well as some traditional. We have an executive council that's made up of each clan has a representative on executive council, which is the executive body. So they execute the decisions for the general council, which is made up of each clan again, right? Appoints people, has people on that council that's make these legislative decisions, these types of things. Executive council executes it. But in a similar type sense, we have sort of the concept of senators or the elders council. And it's kind of like that sober second voice. So a lot of times structures of systems are fairly common, but it's how we implement what we do with those and how we start losing those patterns. So when the Indian Act came in and they had a democratic vote for chief and council, sometimes we saw is that the chief and council was made up of, one clan when there were 6 clans because they were the largest clan, right? And so when we actually went back to our traditional governance model of a clan-based system, it shifted the decision-making, and it wasn't about a clan. It was, so it formed into what is a constitution? What makes up this constitution? Well, I look at a constitution, I start saying, and I don't know if it's cultural or appropriate, but, the dwarves, you look at Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, they have a strong constitution. And so what does a strong constitution mean? It means they're able to go into the mine, and what they do is they mine the gems from the mountain. And there's 7 of them, and there's a whole relationship. And so in our patterns, you start seeing is that constitutions are, nobody can be left out, right? Everybody has to have a voice in there, and you have to find a voice. And this is what the National Roundtable and Yukon Roundtable tried to do, is to get stakeholder groups to have everybody representative, sort of have a voice in that type of thing. And so those are, constitutions, right? And that's what you see over the years that caused a lot of it. When women aren't allowed to vote, when Indigenous people aren't allowed to vote, when you can't own assets, you're left out of this thing. It requires change, right? And that's what happened with the whole feminist movement. That's what happened with the whole modern treaty making processes. These types of things is looking at that change. Anyway, I'm babbling here. So
no, but I think further, Jamie, if I could just quickly to Mark's point, and I think what we're talking about here is the importance of institutional cultures. And when we're talking about co-management, I just think in terms of the 3+ decades that I've spent kind of in that area, that I look back at just, the groups I've been involved with, and how the initial institutional culture, notwithstanding, the recipe, if you will, or the mandates established in the treaty, for instance, with treaty-based institutions, notwithstanding those mandates, how we really fell short in those early days of introducing or implementing or embracing institutional cultures that went a long way to overcome a history of major cross-cultural differences between people. And I'm thinking Indigenous, non-Indigenous peoples. And, I think there's ways to overcome that. And as you do, I just think that the capacity and the capability of these organizations just improves dramatically. So I don't know that we read a lot in the literature when we talk, co-management, co-jurisdiction about institutional cultures and practices. But I think what you're hearing here from both of us is that they're really foundational to the work. And we always talk about legal foundations and how, they're kind of the bedrock, if you will. But I would argue myself that the cultural foundations are every bit as important as the legal foundations. The cultural foundations aren't an add-on. That's something nice to do. They're absolutely fundamental to the practice of these bodies and how they make decisions and how they achieve working relationships.
It's interesting because I've been struggling a bit with this idea of co-governance, co-management, this type of thing. And if we look at our treaties, I'm coming to a point where now co-management is great, but you also have to have co-governance. Now, co-governance is different than paramountcy. It's right. So under the YESAB board or the DAP process, we have sort of a co-governance model. Not 100% there, but basically it's 3 governments getting together saying this is how we want to assess, right? And around that, you set up this thing, but it's still under Yukon Canada's legislation. In Carcross, we started looking at one of the first important pieces of legislation that we wanted to look at was around the family, right? And so what we started doing is, because of the child scoop, because of residential school, because of all of these kinds of issues, we actually started developing a law, a Child Protection Act, or we didn't call it that, we called it the Family Act, because a family has to be strong for any community, right, to exist, if you will. And so Yukon started looking at revising their Child Protection Act. And so, we actually had this discussion saying, do we want to look at working with them to make recommendations about, Yukon's Child Protection Act? And we actually had a debate in our community. And, I said, we're going to lose a year if we don't get it done, right? Because that's what it's going to take to actually look at this. So we made something like 103 recommendations to the Child Protection Act in Yukon. Not one of them made it into the legislation, right? And so we continued on. We started developing our Family Act. And there's some really critical stuff that's important. What we began to recognize is that, Yukon, Canada is throwing a tremendous amount of resources towards child protection, right? And so what happens, that goes into the Yukon's coffers. But for them to actually distribute those resources, right, it actually, they have to apprehend the children, right? So it's fundamental. You say, okay, first of all, when we apprehend the children, then we have money for fostering, for adoption, for programming, right? But it's based on this apprehension of the child, which for us is absolutely the opposite way. So what our legislation began to start doing is saying, look at, first of all, if a family is struggling or hurting, you got to try to provide the resources to the family, the direct family, the nuclear family. If they're not capable or they're not ready to start that, then you have to look at the aunts and the uncles on a clan-based system, right? Because it's on the matriarchal side. And then you provide resources for the aunts and uncles. If they're not able to do it, then the clan has a responsibility to look out for that child. And as a last resort, if the clan can't do it, then the government has to take that. So it's exactly the opposite of how the Western kind of approach to child protection works. And so this is where then we start getting into the idea of co-governance, because co-governance is about legislation. So when we have in the Yukon paramountcy of citizen-based laws, I've now come to the conclusion is that we as First Nations have to exercise those laws. For example, with education, we've been trying in the last 40 years, to deal with education. And there's some stuff about it. And we start saying, and I've talked to governments and they say, we'll fix our laws so it'll work for you, but it hasn't worked in 40 years that we've had treaties in place. And so now I'm starting to say, look, we take 3 months off a year, right? And we're struggling to get 183 school days for these kids. So you can't get any professional days. It's limited because that school year is basically 3/4 of the year. And what I'm saying is that in the summer, because everybody wants those kids to get in the land, to learn on the land, things like that, make their aunts and uncles, especially the matriarchal aunts and uncles, teachers. And to get them out there and to do fish camps, to do hunting camps, to do these kind of camps, berry picking, these types of things, which is a form of education, right? But what we've done is lost basically 1/3 of the year around this the way we've constructed, right, what a school system is. There's some other stuff that's coming out that you start saying, okay, we can actually gain some of this years back. Teachers can still, but we need to define who is a teacher, right? And whether it's the elders that start appointing, people as teachers or qualifying them as teachers for that on the land learning one, and then we give them credit, right? A lot of times what we're finding is that for potlatches, the indigenous people take time off or they go out in the land and they're considered absent from school when they're actually learning, because we haven't redefined what a learning process is or what their pedagogy is or how they look at, or what we define as curriculum, right? And it's considered to be extracurricular when it should actually be a part of the curriculum. So that's where legislation, co-governance comes in. Co-governance is different than governance. So if we do an education act, right? That's government. That's focused on our citizens. Co-governance is when we start saying, okay, we need to have an assessment process. It's on non-selected, non-category A or B lands or whatnot. And what we need is a law that binds us together. What that does then is that collaborative governance or co-governance does, it actually stabilizes our legislative framework. So if you have a change of government, it's a stable, they just can't go out and change the law on their own. Right? They actually have to come back. And, this is part of the thing of where we start looking at co-governance. Management and co-management then is you have a framework around this. You have to have a different relationship and how you implement those legislative frameworks or how we do that and how we define things. The other thing that we found, and I know I'm carrying on too much, but when we did our Family Act, there was actually non-citizens or, the general population and settlers said, we would actually like to fall under that system, but they can't, right? Because they're not citizens and our laws are for our citizens. But at some point in time, governments will have to say, if people want to fall under that governance legislative framework, then they should be allowed to. That's a human right. It should be, right? Because we're recognized governments, right? And I think what this does is that hopefully so we need to be clear on what governance is, co-governance, management is, co-management. It's more than just co-managing. And really, quite frankly, our co-management thing has not been that successful from my perspective.
I was going to ask another question, but maybe that would be a good segue to you, Lindsay. What's your reaction to that comment? What are your thoughts on on if co-management has been successful in Yukon history.
Yeah, I think that first off, with these terms that we typically throw out, and Mark just put out many of them when we're talking, collaborative decision making, co-management, co-jurisdiction, co-governance. That I think up until recently, we've tended to conflate the terms, like it all just gets thrown into this basket, and we don't distinguish finely. We don't respect the fine distinctions between these two between these because they're quite important. So on the point of governance, co-governance or governance is very different from management. As it doesn't matter what system of government you're in. If those concepts shape government, managers are very different from those who are in decision-making positions. So I have always thought of, management are the people who've got tools, or the decision makers provide them with a set of tools to implement them and basically work with them. And so many of us in the co-management environment, our work with various tools that are set out in legal agreements, and are, I think, quite aware at times of the constraints politically of the limitations at the co-governance level, and at times I think, notwithstanding at the level of governance where finally there's this, I think, appreciation that with Indigenous people and non-Indigenous governments in Canada, that there are different systems of laws that apply, even when it comes to recognizing that there are these different systems of law from a co-jurisdiction and co-governance standpoint. The question is, okay, it's one thing to recognize that there are two or multiple sets of laws, some of which are Indigenous, some of which are non-Indigenous, but how do they work with one another? How do they meet? How do they connect? When it comes to, say, do you have legislation that is mirror legislation, so First Nation laws, mirror or state laws, at least in intent, if not in terms of the detail, and vice versa? And so when it comes to First Nations having evolving laws in areas like childcare, family protection, wildlife, whatever, for me, we're still at a place where we're struggling to see how those systems of laws line up or don't, with one another. And I think that's really the next step from a co-management standpoint. One of the issues that often comes up is, well, depending on the treaty that you're looking at, you can have Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments or parties working together. But at the end of the day, who's got the ultimate authority with respect to a decision that's going to prevail? And, in many of our modern day treaties, it's the federal minister of a particular portfolio or a jurisdiction. And that's a hard constraint legally in the treaties. I would argue that notwithstanding that at the co-management level, we are able to kind of achieve certain, again, it goes back to relationships, where we're able actually to move beyond some of those limitations and laws to actually, when it comes to in practice, achieve understandings and breakthroughs and recommendations that are game changers. So in a case, let's take the example of a management body that's got to set a caribou harvest quota. And, state governments or provincial governments are saying, or federal, are saying, look, we want quotas for us are hardwired to address conservation concerns. And Indigenous parties are saying, well, the quota system isn't a system that we are culturally party to. And the way in which we restrict or limit or modify harvesting is really quite different from that. So that's a really good example of how then does a co-management body overcome those differences. Another classic one here, and I know it applies in other parts of the country, is when it comes to fisheries management. Catch and release policies as a conservation tool. Well, from a First Nation cultural perspective, that shows disrespect for the very fish or wildlife that you're dependent upon, not just spiritually, but in terms of your food sovereignty or your food requirements and so on. So, and that of course percolates, that whole system of respect, percolates through into laws. It percolates into practices. So, I think the thing I like about catch and release is it's so clear cut in terms of a black and white difference. It would be the same thing, and Jamie, I'm sure you've come across this, about the place of traditional knowledge alongside of science knowledge. Like, we talk about them having equivalent standing. We talk about them informing one another. The organization that I was chair of, a co-management for many, many years, we had conferences on, traditional knowledge and how it finds its way into the co-management process and the frustrations of trying to get there. We've definitely come a long way, but you get into this. Let's take the example that used to come up, and Jamie, you would have been party to this. Let's take, polar bear as an example. Well, depending on, if you're, a polar bear, harvester, or, you've got, Inuit knowledge, say, of polar bears and the health of a population, you may have a view that your knowledge may say that, these are healthy, sustainable populations. And yet you've got, field biologists who are federally or provincially or territorially employed, and they have a very, very different, based on their research, they land on a very different square. So from a co-management standpoint, the question is, okay, what do you do about that difference? How do you resolve that conflict? And how do you do it in a timely way? And so I think I think, again, to go back, I think we need to take time to have our thinking evolve, but also having our relationships involved. I'm going to give one quick anecdote, which would be the Federal Polar Bear Technical Committee, which, for many, many years was essentially populated by the wildlife biologists of those jurisdictions with polar bears. And then as a result of, the Northern treaties, there suddenly is a requirement that Indigenous representatives be in the room for those discussions, and indeed that their traditional knowledge is going to find a place. I sat in those meetings. They went through tremendous angst in trying to kind of wrestle that through. But I would argue that the PBTC would be a great case example of looking at how institutional cultures and practices and knowledge associated with them, is stressed, but how it actually does adapt over time. And it's still got a ways to go, but it's come a long way from where it once was, and that some people referred to as a good old boys club.
So it's this thing. We've been involved in the Caribou Recovery Program, and is that a co-management, right? I don't know how to frame it as such, but obviously Art John started out and they said, look, at the caribou are in trouble here. We've got to do something about it. They went out and they got First Nations engaged, got Yukon engaged, Canada engaged, right? And it's actually one of the hardest things that we had to do with the whole caribou recovery was to get 9 governments on the same page. Because caribou don't have a Yukon jurisdiction. So we took the Southern Lakes Caribou Herd, right? It involved Taku River Tlingits, Teslin Tlingit Council, Karkwas-Tagish First Nation, Champagne-Ajac First Nation, Kwanlin Ta'an, Yukon government, BC government, and government of Canada. And we had to spend damn near a decade, I would say, trying to get all those governments on board. And it's hard, right? Because when you're trying to look at this management. So one of the things that we began to start doing is that how these governments define stuff is really important. So BC didn't stop outfitters hunting caribou until probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, right? Because the way they defined sustainable harvesting was different than how Yukon, Canada, the First Nations define sustainable harvesting. And so what BC said is, look, we're being responsible because we're doing it as sustainable harvesting, but this is how we've defined it with the point system, right? And those things have to come up. So what we're doing is that we're having to work with 9 governments in co-managing these types of things. Now, what becomes important is that the herd plateaued. We're not sure why, right? So Yukon has been taking data, doing studies, the calf counts. One of the things that we said is that, look at, we don't know what's happening with the caribou, right? First of all, right, is it because we've used up so much of their winter harvesting or summer harvest, right, that they're just not able to get past this plateau? Or is it because they're not caring to term the calves? And so we measure the calf count, but we don't know how many are being impregnated to how many are actually carrying them to term. Mm-hmm. Now, why that's important is because when the caribou rut and they get into their post-rut and all these things, right? Caribou are much more social animal. Moose are an antisocial animal. Mm-hmm. And when they get into their post-rut for moose, for example, that's what my mother said is you got to leave them alone because that's when the seed is setting, right? That's when, this post-rut is a very important time. But what happens, that's when the snow comes, and that's also when the skidoos come, right? Because the first place skidoos want to go is into these mountain areas, which is their habitat, right? When they're transitioning. And we don't know what's happening to those, to the fetuses, to them carrying, because there's no backcountry legislation in the Yukon that sort of sets that. And so you start saying, well, okay, Yukon government, we need some backcountry legislation. They say, oh, no, we don't really, because it's going to take us 3, 4, 5 years to actually develop it and do these things. And you start saying that's not acceptable because the caribou are suffering and we know that they're suffering and so are the moose, right? And so we need backcountry legislation that begins to, right? But if we're not being listened to, do you know what I mean? Then you start saying, well, okay, that's not co-management, right? Same thing we learned with Yukon Council of Economy and Environment. The labor, we're asked to rewrite the labor code. And we did it. And there was about 5 items that we couldn't receive consensus on with this group. And so we sent it back to government. And we said, look, there's 5 areas we need your direction and guidance in how to make these decisions, because we can't get the consensus. And what their response is they cherry-picked the whole thing. And that actually put the group at risk. And so it's very complicated when you get into this co-management, co-government, because in California, when they were trying to, with a group, saying to this group, you guys develop the legislation, we'll just empower it. They were actually taken to court and they lost the case as a government because saying you're actually shirking your responsibility as a government to govern, right? So we know it gets complicated in there. Right. But these are things that you actually have to work through. So the question up front we need to do is how do you limit that to the 5 right? We should have had that discussion at the beginning, right? Rather than right at the end. So those are kinds of things that we're learning that would help co-management in a different type of thing. The other question is that under UNDRIP now, what UNDRIP is basically saying is we're a First Nation or a First Nation has legislation in place. Other governments may have to make best efforts to accommodate or to look at implementing that legislation. So we're using that now to start saying, look, this is where our governance models need to be looked at to incorporate some of that into a co-governance kind of approach so that we can co-manage in a more realistic way, right? And I think you have to follow that process, right, to get there. Because what we're finding a lot of times in our committees, and why I say it's a struggle, a lot of our committees and whatnot are recommending bodies. They recommend to a government that still holds these powers of decision-making when it's not a shared decision-making process. And so you start saying, if we can fix that part, which we could, right, through an adjustment and amendment to the treaties, you would have a better co-management style of which would be founded on a whole different sort of legislative framework in which to co-manage much more meaningfully, right? So I think that's the kind of thing. So it's not that you're saying this is all bad. The question is we know now where there's some issues that we have to fix, right? And how do we do that? Well, that opening up the treaty is a big thing, right? We're going to have to do it. We know that. right? And that's okay. That's what a treaty is, right?
But I would say to that
he's pushing back.
No, I was gonna say to that I think the beauty or the opportunity, not the beauty, the opportunity of forward-looking co-management practices is the practice can, based on goodwill between the parties, actually push past the ceiling of what legally is provided for. So at some point, when the political awareness is there that these different parties are already doing at a working level, working toward these shared outcomes, these consensus, that in these disparate examples or cases, why not take the next step and recognize that formally through legislation or legally? And so, again, it comes back to, being in a co-management environment where those who are at the table have enough trust and goodwill and understanding of one another through the various ways you achieve that we talked about earlier, that you can get to these places. And I think that's a really powerful thing. I think that, to be able to demonstrate with these case examples to, let me say, the ministerial doubters, or for that matter, in circumstances, Indigenous leaders who are doubters based on all sorts of, like a history of broken promises and infringement. There are these kind of case examples to kind of push through. So, taking the example that you mentioned, where you had this roundtable body that achieved a consensus on a wide range of recommendations, except for a small handful of them. I remember two things on that. One is, I remember sitting down with the premier on that, and he said, "Okay, you've got these 5 areas that you can achieve consensus, and he says, and I don't want you to put it to a vote because, like, what am I supposed to do with, 6-4? Is that the basis on which I'm going to make a decision or resolve it?" So I think what we ended, and I thought that was a fair comment, that don't give me this simple majority stuff. Like a consensus is, I want you guys on the same page. And so the page we landed on with respect to the 5 elements that we couldn't agree on was to say, where we have a consensus is we've got a consensus on where we diverge in our judgments and the rhyme and reasons behind them. So I may not agree with you, but I do agree with the rationale that you provided. I respect that. And I'm not just blowing you off because it's a position. I understand the position. I don't agree with it, but I understand it, and vice versa. And that's different from just kind of saying, blowing off the other party. And it's a consensus on what you don't agree on, and you're able to explain the nature of the disagreement. And I think, that's not such a bad thing.
You are listening to a special Yukon edition of the Co-Management Commons podcast, supported by Yukon University and UArctic. The podcast is produced by Cloudberry Connections and hosted by Jamie Snook in collaboration with Kiri Staples and David Silas. Enjoy the rest of the conversation, and thank you for caring about Indigenous co-management and honoring our treaties.
I think we're learning a lot. We did a Tagish River Habitat Plan.
Right.
We based it around seasonal rounds, which is a traditional model, right? What happens on that river in each of the seasons, and how do we accommodate for what's happening? One of the first things that we started, which is, I think, very important, is we started out saying people have to have a relationship to the river. It's not just the residents in Tagish. It's not just the people that come there fishing in the summer. It's not just the tourists, right? So there's a bunch of diversity of users. There's also the animals, right? Because the animals change how they use that river. And so we're trying to look at accommodation. One of the first things that we started saying is people need to reestablish their relationship to that river. And there are ceremonies that do that, maybe offer tobacco, right? And so when we started looking at this kind of stuff, it's a different kind of enforcement that we're looking at, which is a really fundamental difference of Indigenous versus, colonial kind of governance. We try to force people to do things through a colonial governance. What we started from was educating people to do the right thing. What the elders have always said is that if you police yourself and you're trained on how to police yourself, you have 100% police force, right? So you educate people to do the right thing. So we started saying, we want you to reestablish a relationship to that river, because when you have a relationship, how you're going to treat it is going to be different, right? Now, that's not a rule. It was an exhortation, if I could use that word, right? It's not a law. It's not a regulation, right? But it's an encouragement for people to have a relationship to that river. On the other side of the coin, in the Yukon, once you get a fishing license, you can fish all year long, anywhere you want. There's certain catchments. What the elders said is, we know that the big trout run on West Arm, Deep Bay, certain areas at a certain time of the year, September, or grayling at a certain time of the year. And you shouldn't be fishing there, right? And that's where catch and release starts coming in. Part of this thing is because you could throw a line in, catch, and I seen somebody sit there and they caught 25 fish, right, in a matter of a half an hour until they got tired, I guess.
Yeah.
Right? And you start saying that's not right, but because so those are things that you start saying, okay, then we need a regulatory kind of approach to it, where you start saying, look, during that 2-week period, no fishing in these certain areas where the whitefish or the trout or the grayling are spawning or whatever. The other thing we begin to start saying is that, for example, the campground in Tagish, tourists, we're trying to encourage tourism. So we want to open that campground middle of May now. We pushed it back to the end of May. Moose camp there, right? And they drop their calves May, June, right? Right in that period. And if the tourists are there, that actually has an impact on them. We're saying, why not just wait another week or so, right? Until after the first week in June, when the moose have finished, right? But no, because we want everything to be the same, right? And so that regulatory legislation of opening that campground is a problematic, right? And so there's places you can do is exhort or educate people to try to do things. What we said is that a lot of times throwing the fish guts away is problematic, right? Depending on what you do. So we actually put in the plan how to cook fish guts, fish head, to actually utilize it in a traditional way of how to get the most out of that fish. The other thing we said is that if you want a challenge, don't fish off the bridge. Go get a fly fishing rod. Go and see these people that are fly fishermen and catch whitefish on a fly. That's a challenge, because you'll spend all day there trying to catch one whitefish, and you have to learn what you're doing. So those are things that we're educating people how to change their interaction with it is the first line of enforcement. Anyway.
No, what I say further to that is we tend to overstate, I think, particularly in the northern regions, the role of regulation and how effective regulations can be. It's a large landscape, not many people on it. How do you enforce regulations effectively? You can't. And so it comes back again to what we've been talking about is how do you educate people with regard to the practice? And I think we're gaining ground on that all the time. But I think, the practice is everything. I'm thinking, for instance, of in the case of, your First Nation, where, I've been at meetings, and in the morning you'll do a water ceremony. We go behind the building, you're down by the lake, and you do this ceremony. And I'm looking, thinking about, a lot of people, non-First Nation people who are in that ceremony, myself included. And you go through the ceremony and it changes. You may not understand everything that's going on, but by virtue of going through the process, going through that ceremony, at some point you're changed, you're altered by it. And I think that's what's so important about today's conversation when we talk about co-management. And again, to go back, I think this is an element of this that the literature generally misses completely. And I think that's unfortunate when we talk about how to achieve, more progress with respect to co-management arrangements. And I mean, the concept is great. I think for me, historically, it was the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement that brought in, this kind of element for wildlife. It was called the Hunters and Trappers Coordinating Committee, I believe, or the Wildlife Coordinating Committee. That was an attempt to bring, together, the Quebec government, the federal government, and the Cree, to kind of work together. And then after that, it was the Inuvialuit Agreement. The designation for these bodies in the Inuvialuit Agreement is not co-management. It's called joint management, joint committees. And depending on your point of view, you could argue that a joint committee, joint management is very different from co-management in terms of, getting literal about the terms. In joint management, we're equal, we're glued at the hip here, and we've got to make it work for both parties. I think that's implicit, perhaps, to some degree in co-management, but it's not explicit the way it is in the term joint management. So, I'm not just trying to play word games here, but I think that when you're dealing at times with governments, that when it comes to their reading of treaties, they look at the language in the treaty as the ceiling of what's possible, not the platform or the floor for, what you can work from. And I think that's what frustrates, in many cases, the implementation of modern day treaties in many areas, including, wildlife, environmental assessment, and so on. There's lots of ways. I've been in meetings where someone's got a great idea from a policy perspective, and the response is, well, that's not in the treaty. Well, it may not be in the treaty, but isn't it just a good idea? And, why can't we work together to make it work? And I just think that's a tragedy when you don't take advantage of those opportunities.
Well, I think just listening to you both, I think that's probably a tragedy that has been felt over the years in the tension of trying to implement co-management. And when I hear a lot of the things that Mark was saying in terms of moving forward and using words like co-governance, but just different initiatives that you've been involved in, whether it was or creating a family act, getting back to different forms of traditional governance, and a lot of initiatives that connect with cultural continuity, I would say. We didn't get a chance to talk about the river project, but I think that's an example of cultural continuity. And for me, all of that touches on another word that we haven't really explicitly put out there, and this self-determination. It sounds like, Mark, you and your people and the communities are very much moving beyond co-management, whether people like it or not. It seems like there's going to be initiatives to exercise your rights and move the yardsticks forward. That's kind of what I'm hearing in the conversation. But would that be fair to say? Maybe co-management just hasn't kept up in some ways, in the sense that it is a term that's negotiated in treaties, and treaties tend not to get updated very often. While on the ground and in communities, people are have initiative and want to make circumstances better. So that's kind of what I've been hearing as a thread, I guess, throughout your conversation back and forth here this afternoon.
Jimmy, if I may, just to further to your asking or putting to Mark that how the concept of self-determination kind of factors into this broader conversation. I'd like to throw at him as well, and this is you may have talked about this with the other interviews, but I think this is a term that actually kind of came out probably around 2018 with the Indigenous Circle of Experts, but Indigenous-led conservation areas. So when we talk about an Indigenous-led conservation in the context of, in some cases, modern day treaties, or in the case of, say, in British Columbia, in areas where there are no treaties, but conservancies have been established by First Nations. How does the concept of Indigenous-led, when it comes to conservation area or protected areas, or just writ large, and when it comes to manage, what does Indigenous-led mean to you, alongside of, Jamie's query about self-determination?
So just my experience, because I've been struggling with this a lot, right? Recently this summer, we met with the Assistant Deputy Minister of ECCC or Environment or whatever.
Environment and Climate Change Canada.
Yeah. They were up here. And I think I shocked her because I said, I don't think Canada gets enough credit for what they're doing. And if I look at the Maasai that we work with in Tanzania, they're struggling, man.
Yeah.
Right? They're really having it tough. It's where we were 40 years ago, 50 years ago. If I look at Maori, they are doing a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
But even since that last election now, things are going quickly in reverse.
Mm-hmm.
If I look at the Aborigines, right, I started saying, man, they're 30 years behind where we were, right? And if I start going down the list of colonial countries and they're trying to decolonize for their Indigenous populations, right? Canada is way out front. And part of it because we have a Section 35, right? And that Section 35, it's been a hardship for a lot of people, but it's also been an important kind of approach to start having the negotiations, the treaties, those things, the way we're doing them. And much as, we're struggling with the Trudeaus right now, Justin, right, in some of the communities, what his dad did was quite significant, right? Because it started with, okay, if we're going to bring the Constitution back to Canada, what do we do with the Indians? And that's where Bill, what was it, C-69, I think it was, the white paper, where they said, these Indians are just Canadians. And Boulder said, no, we have rights. And so when it did go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, there are rights. We don't know what they are. That's when Trudeau did a 180. He said, okay, if there are rights, let's figure out what we do and how we park it. So in order for them to get the Constitution back, they had to create Section 35, right, to get this back. The other countries don't have that. What we found with the ICE, to me, it's way in the front.
The
right?
Indigenous Circle of Experts.
Yeah, Indigenous Circle of Experts, way in the front of this co-management, which starts not with legislative, but in terms of let's start a dialogue.
Yeah.
And so the whole idea of an ethical space is kind of what we're talking about right now, is creating an ethical space to have this kind of dialogue. It's not about a right or a wrong, but how do we put forward ideas, concepts, suggestions that potentially could be implemented, right? So I think Canada doesn't get enough credit, for some of the stuff it's done. So with the whole IPCAs, it's almost unheard of. Tanzania is trying to do sort of the idea of that, but it's not, right? No. They're making it a treaty as opposed to a conservation area, right? So we look at these examples and you start saying, okay, we've got some, and there's some good stuff that's coming out of it. So when you look at the ICE, the Indigenous Council of Experts, it wasn't only Indigenous people, right? And that's the co-management. That's the foundation of the co-governance, co-management. Now, what sound a loon makes when it's flying? Jamie, if you heard a loon when it's flying make certain noise, that weather's coming?
I'm not familiar, or I don't think I've heard a loon call, but I'm not sure.
That particular song for us?
It's not going to be the song.
Let's hear it.
I grew up, my mother saying, that loon's flying and it's making a noise. Get ready. Rain's coming. Weather's coming. And we'd start just getting busy because we just knew it was true. So when I talk to the scientists about that, they say, well, there's no, that's folklore.
Right.
That's folklore. And then we start saying, well, actually, it's thousands of years of research and data collection, right? That people know that when the loon makes that noise, the weather's coming. And the scientists only take it out of folklore when you understand that the loon, because it's a water animal and an aviation animal, is very sensitive to air pressure changes, to these pressure changes. So a loon is a barometer of what the science would call a barometer when you get an air pressure change or a pressure change, that there's actually, right? And so that's where traditional knowledge gets put aside because it's considered folklore when there's actually thousands of years of science behind it. And I think that's what ICE is beginning to do when they talk about, let's create an ethical space. Because on one hand, natural law, these things that function, is what a lot of that traditional knowledge is, observation and science is based around. Whereas around the more current law, which is climate change, all these things, you have to be much more quicker and adaptive at moving because our traditional knowledge is based on thousands of years. So our standard deviations is in hundreds or thousands of years, where the standard deviation of climate change is probably 5 years now to 10 years, right? And what we're doing is that the measurements that we have, the data that we're collecting, to accommodate and mitigate climate change has to be much shorter. But that doesn't mean all that traditional knowledge is invalid yet, because there's still loons still make noise. Do you mean when that changes? Because the science is there, that traditional science is there, right, to do that. Anyway, I think, when to go back to this question, what we've been learning in the last 40 years in the Yukon, what the ICE report is doing, is there's a lot of good people that have very similar interests that want to look after this planet we call Earth, and they're working together to try to make suggestions. What we're dealing with oftentimes is a changing thing. Now, this is what the Hopi prophecies talk about, right? The Hopi prophecies says that when it comes a time when we forget the sacred teachings, which are really basic, disruption occurs, fighting will occur, disagreement occurs, and we're going to get wars, if you will. And that's what the elders have been saying. We've got to go back to those sacred teachings. So recently, the Climate Action Fellowship group in the Yukon spent, about 4 years ago now, they started working on this, what's a First Nation response to climate action. And they came up with it. The way I summarize it is they came up and said, Mother Earth is hurting and she needs healing. But in order for us to try to heal her, we have to heal ourselves. And for us to heal ourselves, we have to get back to the land. So the reconnection vision is getting back to the basics, to the natural environment, to these things, and learning what that natural law does and pulling it into that ethical space so that we can adjust our colonial or governmental legislation to accommodate that kind of thinking based on those traditional values. Anyway, did I answer both questions in one shot or not? Kerry, you're the moderator.
I would say, though, further to that, taking the example of the Indigenous Circle of Experts. So their report, Rising Tide, I think it was called. It's the Indigenous Circle of Experts was a group within Parks Canada, and they put out a report, and you read the report, and it introduces a whole sensibility about how you can look at conservation areas that's very different. And the nice thing about the report is to give the government its due. Is they said, okay, we're going to set up a program to fund the development and establishment of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Whole new concept, at least from a federal perspective. As I said, I think in BC, the conservancies that were launched by coastal nations and so on, they showed great leadership there. So I think that small step is a really, really important step. Another one would be Parks Canada the other day, or I guess this past year, came down with Parks Canada's policy for Indigenous stewardship. And again, it's really progressive thinking in terms of the larger conversation we're having here about how people work together and better understanding, the relationship Indigenous people and landscapes and so on. So I take great heart in that. Thirdly, the acronym is IAI, the Federal Environmental Impact Assessment Agency. They've come up with guidelines now on essentially an assessment guidelines for assessing impacts on Indigenous rights. And it's a method, and you look at that, and quite frankly, it changes how you do environmental assessment methodologically in a big way. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. And then finally, take the example of, federally, but in British Columbia, an act to implement UNDRIP. The government of the Northwest Territories just passed legislation to implement UNDRIP. You just read the recitals or the preambles in those, and it's about people working together. It's about how you cross these historic divisions between people, and of course, I think the argument will be, okay, well, you've got an act to implement UNDRIP. What does it actually look like when you get down to it? Well, who knows how well it's going to work out or how forward-looking it may be. But at the very least, this is another foothold. It's another step forward to get people in the room trying to look at these relationships and what makes for one that's going to work for everybody.
Well, Mark, why don't I just, in interest of respecting both your time today, why don't we give you, Mark, the final word? I'll let you sum up sort of your take-home message that you'd like for people to come away with from this podcast today?
I think Lindsay kind of hit it, right? Because what we're starting to do is look at co-management, co-governance, whatever we call it, it's moving, right? And that's why I say, as you look at Canada, some of the stuff that it's done, right? It's huge, right? If you look at, we're doing how we walk with the land and water, which is traditional sort of land and water planning process, right? And we're throwing around ideas, and these aren't necessarily new. It's just starting to reframe in Western terminology some of their things. So when the salmon are spawning, they have fee simple ownership of their spawning grounds. Now, the word of fee simple has a whole bunch of implications, right? Because that means that, there's certain things can and can't happen there. But what you're saying is that you can't wreck those spawning grounds because they own it. And so I think where we're going, it's moving and it's emerging. And I appreciate these kind of conversations and some of the things that we're doing, because co-management is an important step. I mean, that was a huge, huge step. UNDRIP comes in, free, prior, and informed consent. And that's something we're starting to saying is, okay, how do you incorporate that into here? Because that's above co-management in a lot of cases, right? So how do you look at co-management? And I think that's the relationship building that you start saying, maybe we shouldn't be hunting moose after October 31st, after Halloween, right? Because moose are in really poor condition. It's not worth hunting them. The only reason you're hunting them is because you want a trophy, right? Well, doesn't apply anymore. So, and I think those discussions, don't get me wrong, because I think these are all important. These discussions are important because it's how we start emerging. And earlier, talking with Curie, that generation has to bring this home. Right. So we're having discussions on this level, but we need to start thinking differently, doing things differently, and actually looking at, okay, how do we integrate and how do we move this together? So that's why I think these kind of podcasts, this kind of discussion is critical, right, to changing, the shape of how we move ahead together as a people.
Yeah, I think the question that many of us don't raise till late in our lives, which is unfortunate, is the question of, what kind of ancestors do we want to be? And I think if we thought hard about that question, we'd transcend a lot of gridlock.
Yeah. Lindsay got the last word, and I don't know how he does it every time.
Did he do that all those years when he was facilitating those co-management meetings? Was it always like that?
Yeah, always reminds me.
Oh, he did it. He did it. Very well done, Lindsay. And I want to thank both of you for your time today. This is greatly appreciated, and know that people all across our country will get a chance to listen to you both. And I think by having these types of conversations, you're continuing to make contributions, like sharing these insights and reflections on what has happened and is happening in settings like the Yukon are certainly invaluable to people in other regions. So I just wanted to really thank you both and sincerely mean that, and it was greatly appreciated.
Thank you for listening to the full podcast. Please like the podcast, subscribe, and leave comments so we can connect. If you are interested in joining a dedicated Indigenous community of practice with many of Canada's leading practitioners and thinkers in this area, you can skip over and visit our website at www.co-management.ca. Getting signed up is easy, and professional development is a tangible and effective way to show your commitment to reconciliation.